All right, so let's go ahead and we'll delve into kind of part three of the module. So our last one here. And what we're going to do is talk about kind of more modern views of the self. And what I mean by this is that when we explore the self, okay, we think about our who we are. Okay, we can think about things not only in terms of just traits, okay, so how we evaluate ourselves on these different dimensions, okay, but research in personality also includes the topic of a person's sense of self. Okay, so what do I mean by a sense of self? This might be something that you could kind of inherently understand, but we need to kind of operationalize it, give us a clear definition for it. And so when we talk about the self, we talk about it as the core of a personality, the organizer and reservoir of our thoughts, feelings, actions, choices, and attitudes. Okay, so the self is the core of a personality. It's the organizer of our organizer and reservoir, okay, of our thoughts, feelings, actions, and choices. So when we think of our sense of self, we can think about it as a way that we kind of interpret, organize information. Okay, so we can take in stimuli that surround us, take in experiences we're having, and bring it to the sense of self to know how these experiences, how these thoughts are related to who we are. Okay, so, if we become particularly upset if we see something that seems like an injustice or wrong, we know that our sense of self then has a high degree of needing to see equality, okay, being concerned about others. We can see this in terms of our actions. Okay, we can evaluate the actions that we've done and see how that relates back to our sense of self. So, I'm excited to get out for my run today. I've been running consistently. This all comes back to the sense of self of, trying to, stay healthy, maintain good mental health as we go through this kind of quarantine. All these things kind of come back to the sense of who we are. I'm kind of laughing right now. It's Thursday, which means our lawnmower guy that comes through and cuts everyone's yard except for ours in the neighborhood is out cutting the grass. And something simple as just seeing him do that activates that sense of self that I have of making sure I take care of the house. The fact that I need to get out there and cut the grass myself this weekend. Okay? It helps me organize the experiences that are around me. And when we talk about the sense of self, it relates to several different concepts. Okay, so we'll just kind of list these out for you, give you a sense of where we're headed, but then we'll talk about them more specifically. So our sense of self is related to culture. Okay, so this idea of individuals and collectivism. And we'll highlight how this is actually very relevant to the COVID virus and trying to eliminate it as quickly as possible. We'll talk about the spotlight effect. So you guys will see that actually this is something that you're well versed in, you experienced it before. We'll talk about it in terms of self-esteem, and we'll talk about it in terms of self-serving bias. We won't get into narcissism as much. Narcissism really is related to kind of having a grandiose sense of self, having a high sense of self-worth that others need to really kind of be behaving in a way that's consistent with to support you, otherwise you become aggressive towards them. But we'll focus on these first couple of ones. So let's go ahead and move into talking about culture and the sense of self. Again, this is just kind of setting us up. The big piece here that we want to make sure we're attending to is this definition of the self. Again, we're going to talk about how each of these senses of self related to culture, spotlight effect, self-esteem, and our self-serving biases all relate back to our sense of self, how we organize things around us. So what I'd like you guys to do now, and please make sure that you're doing this, even though we're not able to do it as a class together, is write down 20 statements answering this following question. Okay? So write down 20 statements answering the question, who am I? So write down these statements as quickly as you can. Don't think too hard about them. Begin each statement with I am, and then complete that. Okay, so you might say, I am a student. Okay? I am excited. So go ahead and write these out. Just write them out as they occur. Don't rank them or anything like that. So I'll give you guys a few minutes to go ahead and do this, to list out these 20 different statements, each of which are all going to begin with I am. So continue on. I'll give you guys about 1 more minute. Again, write down as many of these statements as you can. Try to work towards that 20. Again, think about statements starting with I am. All right, so as you're wrapping up your statements, go ahead and chat and share some with me, some of the statements that you wrote down. Okay, so jump in, share with me some of the 20 different statements that you wrote down to this question. Let's get kind of a collection of these, then we'll evaluate them a bit together. We'll do a kind of analysis as a class. Okay, so share with me some of the statements that you wrote. I'm Groot, very nice. All right, love the responses. Let's get a few more. Okay, so let's get 2 or 3 others. And if you've chimed in already, you can chime in again. Okay, retail worker. Okay, political party. Okay, I'm motivated. We see stress. Those ones that were coming up. Now, let's take this list that you put together. Okay, think you're hungry, hardworking. Okay, let's take this list that you put together. And what I want you to do is I want you to go ahead and tally up the statements. So you're going to do a little bit of kind of categorizing these. Okay? What I want you to do with these is I want you to categorize them, okay, based on whether they're personal attributes, so characteristics about you, versus social groups, so groups that you identify with. Okay? So what I want you to do is go ahead and tally these up, okay, and then take note if you have more personal attributes, okay, versus social groups. Okay, so I'll give you guys a minute to tally these up. Once you've got it tallied up, go ahead in the chat room and indicate if you have more personal attributes that you listed or more social groups that you listed. And this is where I was hoping to have a poll that we could complete it there, but I'll practice with those again, try to get those working for us. Okay, let's get a few more responses. Again, those personal attributes to describe things more about yourself, such as saying, I'm awesome, you know, I'm outgoing, versus more social groups, groups that you're part of. So one of the things that you can see as we look at our chat coming in, I appreciate you guys responding there. And we would see this to kind of a show of hands if we were in the classroom, is that for the most part, we see that when people do this task, that they tend to give more personal attributes. Now, when we say this, we're really referring, though, to more individualistic cultures such as our own. Okay, so one of the things we see as we think about the self is we can apply this idea of cultural differences related to individualistic and collectivist cultures. Okay? So people in collectivist cultures emphasize group unity, allegiance, and purpose. And they do this over the wishes of oneself. So what we're seeing when we look at our response is we're reflecting this more of this individualistic culture. The individualistic culture, especially we have in the United States, is the sense that we all want to be unique and distinct. Okay? That we're focused on kind of being the best person we can be, kind of optimizing who we are. We want to stand out. Okay? In collectivist cultures, that's not necessarily the case. They emphasize more group unity, allegiance, and purpose. Okay? They do this with the idea that they want to be more communal. They want to focus on things kind of collectively together, and that their role of being successful as a person is to support others, to help others out in their positions. And we see this collectivist culture coming out in a couple of different ways. So we see this as credit for success is given more to others. So one of the things you'll distinctly see during the Olympics, which unfortunately is also postponed because of things, but in past Olympics, is that when an athlete wins, maybe in an individual sport, they're more likely to give credit to their success to their coaches, to their teammates. They say, oh, I had a great coach. My teammates supported me. They helped me train well. And so they're more willing to give that credit to others in more of those collectivist cultures compared to more individualistic culture, such as our own. We start to see the individuals who are successful in sports, especially individual sports, say, oh, it's my day. I worked really hard for this. I really rose to the occasion. It's kind of all about them. Conversely, too, they say that when failure occurs, they take it on themselves. They see that they didn't do their part to do well. Rather than in individualistic cultures, we're likely to pass that blame off to others. And part of that is because by passing that blame off on others, that failure off on others, it protects our self-esteem, which is something we'll talk about here in just a minute. So with collective cultures, again, the idea is that a good person is someone who really fits in well. They don't want to stand out. They're trying to make sure that they do things well on behalf of others. They're not concerned about being unique and distinct, such as we are. And I think what's interesting is we watch the COVID virus, the COVID pandemic, and we're trying to understand how different countries are dealing with it, that some of the more collectivist cultures, I would argue, are dealing with it better compared to more individualistic cultures. And the reason why I make that argument, and you may agree or disagree with it, is in more collectivist cultures, the idea is that being a good person during this time is to make sure that you're following the rules so that you're not getting others sick. Okay? That everyone's kind of in it together. That if you're being a good person, you're staying in, you're following the rules. You're okay with kind of more draconian rules that are in place, things like that, because it's the benefit of the larger group. In more individualistic cultures, the idea is that you still want to stand out, be distinct. You still think that you can do things as you need to. There's less of an importance of kind of being concerned about the other person. That's not really kind of built into the DNA of kind of operating as well. And so keep an eye on this. You can decide as you're kind of watching news stories, tracking the pandemic, if you agree or disagree with it. But I think there's kind of more that collectivist culture allows some of these countries to kind of act more together and collectively and kind of implement rules and policies that help everyone faster more than individualistic cultures where we want to be distinct and unique and continue doing the things that make us who we are. Let me talk about one other kind of concept related to self, and then I'll pause there and kind of make sure that we're set with things. Another way that we think about our sense of self is this idea of self-conscientiousness. This idea that people are kind of evaluating you, and you're thinking about how that evaluation reflects you. You're thinking about how others are evaluating you, and that kind of goes back towards who you are and your self-esteem. So we'll kind of highlight this by sharing kind of a ridiculous study. And then I'll give you kind of a real world example of this so we can process it. So in this particular study we're going to highlight here, students put on a Barry Manilow t-shirt before entering a room with other students. The idea here is that by wearing this Barry Manilow shirt, that this is kind of a weird shirt that people really would kind of maybe recognize and say, that's just kind of a strange shirt. And participants, those wearing this Barry Manilow shirt walking into the room, anticipated that, I think it was like something like at least half the room would notice this weird shirt that they were wearing. And in fact, what they found in this research is that that wasn't the case. The students thought others would notice this t-shirt, assuming that people were looking at them, paying attention, and in fact, that wasn't the case. I think, in fact, it was only somewhere around 25% of the group actually noticed the participant wearing this shirt. And so the idea here is that we greatly overestimate the extent to which the spotlight was on them. Okay, so greatly overestimate the idea that the spotlight's on us in different situations. And so what this drives at, okay, is what we call the spotlight effect. The spotlight effect is assuming that people have attention focused on you when they actually may not be noticing you at all. Okay, so I'll read that for you again, because the spotlight effect, I think, is a really interesting phenomenon. I think it's one that if you're aware of this, it helps you kind of manage social situations a little bit better. And again, the idea here is that the spotlight effect is this assumption that people have attention focused on you when they actually maybe not noticing you at all. So I know for a fact we've all had this experience of being in a classroom, being in a group meeting, and you want to open up, a pop can, maybe a bag of chips, something else that might rustle or make noise. I know I had a research assistant that bought a brand new bag that he loved, but he had to open up this Velcro to get into it, and it was really kind of annoying. And when you open up that can of pop or this Velcro bag, you're concerned that it's going to make this noise and everyone's going to turn around and look at you. Everyone's going to kind of pay attention. You might even find yourself kind of opening up that pop can or kind of, pulling the tab back a little bit, kind of pull back. And then when it's about ready to pop, you pop it as fast, as quickly as you can to kind of minimize that noise. And you kind of almost put the can away so that it's not out there for anyone to see. Okay, the bag of chips, you might open it super, super slowly, kind of very carefully pulling it apart, trying to kind of minimize that amount of noise. Because you don't want to distract others. Or Jason, my research assistant, said, kind of pull the Velcro kind of really slowly so maybe others wouldn't notice. And that demonstrates this spotlight effect because you assume that people have a focus on you. But really the lesson to take away from here is that people don't notice our errors. They don't notice our quirks and our features and shirts as much as we think they do. The idea here with these examples is that no one gives a crap when you open up that can of pop that you're making noise. Okay, so no one's really paying that close of attention to you that you're really disturbing them that much. Okay, so instead of taking your time opening up that bag of chips or the bag with the Velcro on it, just open it because people aren't paying close attention to you. We overestimate how much people are looking at us. This is something to keep in mind too, that when we're interacting with others and maybe want others to notice us, we don't want to assume that people are actually noticing us. We don't want to assume that there's this spotlight on us, that in fact we're kind of really overestimating how much people look at us. We can also relate this to giving a presentation. So a lot of times students get really nervous about giving a presentation and kind of feel like all eyes are on them, like the whole class is focused on them. When really that's demonstrating the spotlight effect as well, is that students aren't always really paying attention to that speaker. Okay, so they may be focused on the slides that you're presenting, the content that you're presenting. They might be integrating the content with their own thoughts. Okay? They're not sitting there noticing every little thing that you do. Okay, so sometimes when students present for the first time, they'll say things like, I'm a little nervous. Well, if you don't point that out, actually, no one's really going to notice. You're overestimating people, really having that spotlight on you and seeing that you're acting that particular way. People don't notice these kind of quirks, these experiences, as much as we think they do. So let me pause at this point to see what questions you have related to self-conscientiousness and collectivism. So if you're all good, let me know over chat, say you're all good. Otherwise, I'll pause for just a minute, kind of capture questions you have about these first two ways of thinking about the self before we continue on with our next two. So far, it looks like we're good. Let me kind of pause to see if there's anything else. All right. So let's talk about our next two aspects of the self. The first of these next two being self-esteem. And thinking about what self-esteem is, kind of how it functions, the way it increases or decreases. So when we talk about self-esteem, people who have normal or high self-esteem feel confident, valuable, and get benefits from this. Okay, so our self-esteem is our evaluation of kind of our self-worth, okay? The evaluation of how positive we feel towards ourselves. And individuals with these normal levels of self-esteem, they feel confident, they feel that others value them, that they can make contributions, If they're a good person, they generally have a positive attitude towards themselves. And this normal and high level of self-esteem is helpful because it increases our resistance to conform to pressure. Okay, so when others are trying to get you to do something you don't want to do, um, or to kind of stick with kind of norms, things like that, someone higher in self-esteem is not as compelled to have to do that. They feel like they can kind of be on their own. It decreases harm from bullying. So the idea here is that, again, you're less influenced by others. You're able to kind of stand up more for yourself. You're able to be resistant to the consequences of it. And I think what self-esteem really helps us with is it increases our resilience and efforts to improve our own mood, our own abilities. So by having higher self-esteem, you're able to take on these challenges. Okay? You're able to do this because you're willing to kind of get knocked back if things aren't going well. You can kind of still feel good about yourself even if things aren't quite going the way that you want them to. You're able to kind of bounce back and be resilient. And so having normal and high self-esteem is good. Again, hinting at narcissism a little bit, when we have excessive amounts of high self-esteem, that's where you might think you're grandiose, you're immune to kind of any negativity. You need others to constantly bolster your self-esteem, though, and that's where it becomes problematic. Now, one of the things that is tricky, though, is that maybe this high self-esteem is really realistic and as a result, not a cause of these successes. Okay, so maybe the idea here is kind of thinking about, well, is our self-esteem really kind of causing our successes? Or is it potentially too that when we think about self-esteem is that it's a function of having successes, but maybe it gets built up based on false successes? Okay, so we want to have positive self-esteem. We derive this self-esteem, feeling good about ourselves, because we've done things well, we've been successful. But we can also potentially inflate this self-esteem by believing we did things successfully when it really wasn't that hard to do. So we have to be a bit careful about this. We also have to be careful too with our low self-esteem because that has negative consequences as well. So low self-esteem, even when it's kind of temporarily lowered in experimental contexts, such as receiving insults, lower evaluations on something we've done, starts to lead to problems in terms of individuals start to become more prejudiced. Okay, so as a way of coping with the fact their self-esteem is lowered, they start to become more negative towards others, start to experience more negative affect towards minority groups, especially those groups that maybe are making them feel inferior. Okay? And similarly too, they start to become more critical of others. Okay, so by becoming critical of others, they can kind of make others believe that others are kind of lower value, lower worth, meaning they kind of prop themselves up. They start to feel higher self-worth when they're feeling this low self-esteem. So we see that self-esteem is really critical for our well-being. We need, normal to high amounts of it, reasonable amounts to be persistent in tasks, to manage our mood. When it's too high, we start to question, why is that the case? Why do we have such high levels of self-esteem? And it starts to become problematic because you start to develop narcissism. Conversely, being too low allows us to then, have difficulties, starts creating longer-term problems in terms of being prejudiced, critical to others, kind of potentially harming that person that you're interacting with. And so what we see with self-esteem, and if you take social psychology with me, we talk about this quite a bit, is that we do a lot to protect our self-esteem. Okay, so I want to kind of focus on that. Now is kind of our last aspect of talking about the self, which is the self-serving bias that we have. Okay, so this will be the last piece we'll talk about in terms of our sense of self before we'll do a Kahoot review. So our self-serving bias is this idea that we all generally like to think that we're above average. Okay, so in fact, we call this the Lake Wobegon effect. The idea is that if you live at Lake Wobegon, everyone believes that they're above average, they're smarter, they're better looking on average, they're better able to do things on average. Okay, so you do surveys of managers and saying, how do you compare to other managers? And a huge percentage say that they're better than other managers, they're above average. Very, very, very small percent, only 1 to 2%, say that they're below average. And we know that that's a problem because when you have averages, only half the group can be above average, only half the group can be below average. But we want to think of ourselves as being above average because that makes us distinct, unique, and helps us feel more positive. And remember, with that positive self-esteem, it allows us to take on more of these challenges. And what happens here is we can start to get into how these kind of biases defend our self-esteem. Okay? So you might start thinking more negatively about another group member. So you might think about them negatively. You might do downward comparisons. So maybe I didn't do well on the exam, but my friend did even worse. Okay, so you feel better about that. We see this when maybe you don't do well on an exam. Okay, so maybe you don't do well on an exam. Instead of saying, hey, I didn't prepare for the exam, I didn't understand the material well, you might say, no, the professor wrote a bad exam. Okay, or he didn't cover the material well. Or maybe even saying, hey, because we're online now, it makes it harder to learn, which it does. It's a new challenge for us. But the idea is that we can protect our self-esteem by making these self-serving biases, by saying things in a way that make us feel good, potentially at the harm of others, but they protect our self-esteem. Okay, so this is why we do it. In some cases, it's protecting our self-esteem, helping us to continue on. In other cases, too, keeps us kind of having a true realization of kind of how we're performing in different contexts. So again, we see that self-esteem is a critical piece. It gets related to culture, okay, in terms of different cultures derive their self-esteem from different places. It gets related to this spotlight effect, where part of the spotlight effect is believing that others are kind of evaluating us, kind of getting our self-worth from the evaluations of others. So I want to pause here for a moment to see if there's any kind of general questions before we'll try to give a Kahoot review. We'll try to try this out in the online context. I wanted to do the polling on the Kahoot today. So far, polling didn't work, but let's see if we can get Kahoot to work for us like it has before. Okay. So let me pause to see what questions you guys have. If you're good, let me know over chat that you're good. All right, so it seems like we're good. Give me a minute to get us switched over to Kahoot. You can go ahead and open up Kahoot on your computer, your iPad, your phone, wherever you have nearby. Let's see if we can get this working for us. Majority responses over that psychoanalytic. Remember, the idea here with psychoanalytic is they're thinking about kind of your past experiences in terms of your development, how these repressed childhood conflicts in terms of getting through the psychosexual stages, resolving issues with parents. All these are related to that psychoanalytic perspective. So remember, as you're studying, as you're preparing for the exam, getting ready to go, think about these different perspectives that we talked about with personality development, especially kind of the classic perspectives, the original perspectives, and how they vary between each other. Okay, so nicely done. Let's go ahead and go on to our next question. going through. The idea is that Jaden's balancing out that id and that superego. Okay, so it is this basic drive. Okay? The superego is realizing kind of this ideal standard. So Jaden, in this case, wants that ideal standard of being successful in the career. Okay? But instead, this alcohol abuse is starting to come through. And we would argue that Jaden has a weak ego because Jaden's not able to kind of manage this desire to be drinking. And so because of this is where he's not realizing that alcohol abuse is causing problems. He's not able to kind of control this id impulses that he has. Okay? We wouldn't say he has a weak id because he has a strong id. It's a basic drive that he's got to consume alcohol. That's consuming him. And we wouldn't say he has a strong superego because remember that superego is more that kind of idealized self, kind of what you're trying to work towards. If that were the case, he had a strong superego, he would be able to kind of stop this alcohol abuse that is causing him problems. So questions about this particular question, why what I shared hopefully makes more sense. Okay, things that aren't quite clear. All right, okay, let's go on to our next one. Again, make sure that you're spending time with id, ego, and superego though, because it's a concept you want to work with a little bit. Maslow's hierarchy, his pyramid of needs, you see at the top of it is kind of working towards that self-actualization. Remember that self-actualization being open, spontaneous, being able to take in the opinions of others, be able to critically evaluate things in a non-judgmental way. So think about that particular term. Okay, so think about this kind of more humanistic perspective to understanding personality. Okay, so nicely done there. Okay. All right, question number 4 of our 6. Nicely done. Again, the whole characteristic aspect of humanistic psychology, again, moving away from psychoanalytic, is focused more on a positive self-concept, how you help someone develop in a healthy way that helps them be successful, versus that psychoanalytic was more focused on past conflicts, these internal conflicts. So keep in mind these different philosophies, each type of psychology, or each type of personality psychology is really focused on. This is what really defines humanistic psychology. All right, let's go on to our 5th question. This helps us with just kind of thinking about the trait theory of personality, giving us kind of the foundation, the building point. Really, Eisnick focused on extroversion, introversion, something that carried over into our big 5. Remember, his other idea was this emotional stability and instability. So that was the other kind of dimension that he looked at in terms of are these traits that are consistent throughout time, or are they ones that kind of shaky, that are kind of occur different points, but then start to dissipate and go away. Okay, so keep in mind kind of that way of initially kind of starting to think about these trait characteristics that we talk about all the time now. All right, let's go to our last question here. Nicely done. It's an important component to make sure that you're set and have the operationalization of personality. Again, this is an individual's pattern of thinking, feeling, and acting. You guys have the idea behind this, something we reviewed at the beginning of class as well. So nicely done there. So I appreciate you guys jumping in and participating. Congratulations to those of you that ended up on the podium here. Try to bring some good reviews back in as we kind of go through and do things. That kind of wraps us up in terms of talking about personality. Then as we start kind of start turning into a little bit more focusing a bit more now on psychological disorders. Okay, so this, we'll see how it ties into, we'll see how this starts to tie into personality here as we go along. Okay? But we'll start to focus more on what happens when you have kind of these set of personality traits that become problematic for an individual. Okay, problematic to the extent that they now start to exhibit traits that cause them to have difficulties with social interactions, connecting with others, doing those basic things that we need in order to reach that self-actualization, if we think about things from Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Now, there's a bit for us to kind of lay out in terms of talking about psychological